Welcome to The Immigrant's Path, showcasing the successes, challenges, and the many paths to America. Brought to you by Sarraf Gentile LLP, a New York-based law firm representing individuals nationwide on immigration and other complex litigation matters.
Hi, my name is Joe Gentile. I'm the host of The Immigrant's Path. Today's guest is Sara Saedi. She's the author of Americanized, Rebel Without a Green Card. I read the book, loved the book. I asked her to be a guest, and I'm really happy she said yes. So the book basically takes you through her journey growing up in California as an undocumented immigrant from Iran. It also goes through her family's journey, and it goes through a lot of Iranian culture, which is great. I found Sara to be a great guest. She, as an attorney, when I look at what we do with immigrants and, how we approach problems in general, we approach it with logic frequently, and we approach it very fact-based and very analytically. And what Sara really drives home is just the power of storytelling and the power of humor, that both of those tools play such probably a bigger role, to be honest, in changing the public conversation and the public impression of issues. And I think that's also the case with immigration. Sara accomplishes more, I think, to change people's opinions on immigration by going through her story than I think you can by writing something that's very, policy and logic based about how much immigrants economically benefit the U.S. and all these other different arguments. So this was a great interview. Also want to mention that Sara is currently putting together a series for HBOMax on the Green Lantern, so that should be awesome. So in addition to recommending the book, which I really liked, I'd also encourage you to check out that series, especially if you're a superhero fan like I am. Thanks. Enjoy the interview. Today's guest is the acclaimed writer, Sara Saedi. She's a writer on numerous popular TV shows, including Katie Keene, Grand Hotel, iZombie, and the upcoming Green Lantern on HBO. She's also the author of numerous books, including her excellent memoir, Americanized, Rebel Without a Green Card. Her memoir details her experience of growing up as an undocumented immigrant in California. Welcome, Sara. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. Throughout, I read the book and I really liked it. It had a lot of impact on how I view the undocumented experience. And one thing that struck me in reading it, and maybe this is just because I'm an introvert by nature, is you're putting a lot of yourself out there personally about you and your family, and you're subjecting that to public consumption and kind of public commentary. What's that been like? What's the public's reaction been to your book as it's been relayed to you?
I would say it's been mostly, luckily, positive. A lot of the feedback that I've gotten, similar to what you just said, is like, oh, I never knew how challenging, it was to become a permanent resident of this country. So I think it was illuminating for a lot of people that didn't know much about the immigration process. And then it's funny because my concern wasn't so much like, am I going to get backlash? Am I putting too much of myself out there? It was really more like, is anyone going to care about this book beyond people who know me personally and my family? Like, you just always wonder, like, I don't feel like I'm that interesting. I don't know if anyone's going to care. So that was really more my concern when the book was initially published. And one of the things that's just been really fun, that's sort of an aside from the immigration angle of the book, is that a lot of people who grew up in the 90s, who were my age during that era, just really enjoyed the nostalgia factor of the book too. So I feel like that was sort of a more universal element for people of my age group. And yeah, I've definitely, like, depending on, when I started doing some press for the book, depending on where articles were, like there was one interview I did with Yahoo and the comments were really tough.
Oh, Yahoo's
And
brutal.
there's been some commentary on Twitter that's a little bit
Mm,
hard to stomach. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it was actually good for me because you don't want to be sort of living in your bubble of praise. So I think it was really interesting to hear other people's more negative perspectives on my
mm,
story. And I actually have made it a rule to not. I used to go on Goodreads, which is a website where people can review books
right.
and read a lot of the commentary there, and sometimes respond to some of the commentary. And I've had to learn to not do that anymore. But I think for my family, the tricky part about writing a memoir is that you're not just putting your story out there; you're putting other people's
Right.
stories out there too. And what was really important for me was to give them let them read the parts of the book that they were in, and ask them if there was anything that they didn't feel comfortable with me putting in the book.
Mhm.
And just being very respectful of that, and wanting to make sure that I told our story in an honest way, but that I didn't want to offend anybody in the process.
Mhm.
And I think there's one chapter where I talk about a really terrible argument with my parents, and I was really worried that they would be upset that I wrote about it. But everybody was actually really supportive, and I think at the end of the day, we're just really, like, thrilled to have our story out there. Especially, I think it's been the most meaningful to hear from other undocumented immigrants or kids of undocumented immigrants, because I feel like the book has given them a lot of comfort.
Yeah.
And that was really, like, that's the best thing to come out of it.
Yeah. One thing I got out of it too, just and it's been a series of reminders for me as I get older. And this has nothing really to do with the immigration piece. Is I'm about the same age as you, or we're roughly the same age based off the nostalgia that you're putting out there. And just looking back to my time in high school, it's just shocking to me how little we know about what's going on with our classmates' lives. And how little they know about what's going on with our lives in some ways. We're focused on a lot of this stuff that's, that you describe in the book that, is important of the moment. What does my skin look like right
Yeah,
now? And, who likes who and all
right.
that. And we're just completely ignorant to the dramas and all the things going on behind the scenes with family life and whatnot. So it was a good reminder of how we think we know something, but we really know such a small facet of it sometimes. Um, so
So true. I mean, it's very interesting to think about the current generation of kids in high school, because I feel like everything, like, we didn't have social media. So I feel
mm,
like with social media, you're putting more of yourself out there, but so much of it is so carefully curated too,
mm,
that you could probably say the same thing. They think maybe they're getting a window into what people's lives are really like, but they're probably not at
yeah,
all.
it could all be true, but misleading at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when you decided to write this book, who's the target audience that you had in mind?
Well, I had done young adult in the past. I had written two fiction books that were YA, and so and I have to say, it's sort of a space that I feel very comfortable in, because I still feel very connected to myself as a teenager, and I also feel like in some ways, I mean, this is probably very, very unfair to many brilliant young adult writers, but I feel like you can be a little bit more colloquial in your writing, and it can
Mm,
be a little bit more forgiving when it comes to the writing, because your audience is younger. Um, so I think I just feel more comfortable, and I feel less pressure in that space in a lot of ways. But I think that, the book was definitely is YA, and it was marketed as young adult. But like I mentioned, I do think that older generations responded to it. Like, many of the teachers that I've talked to that
mhm.
teach the book in their classrooms responded to it because of the fact that they're around the same age as me. But yeah, I think really because I am writing about a time when I was a teenager,
Mhm.
teen readers were our target audience.
And did you have an intended impact on that audience that you were aiming for in sharing your story?
I hope so. I mean, I think the best part about it being taught in high schools is that, especially some of the high schools that maybe don't have a lot of diversity in various parts of the country, I feel like it gave them a little bit of exposure to a story that they wouldn't really necessarily come across in their day to day.
Mhm.
And I went and visited my high school in the Bay Area. I've talked to high schools in like the Midwest. I talked to a high school in Senegal. So I mean, and that's the great thing about being able to use Zoom also to just
Mhm.
do these school visits without having to travel. And yeah, I mean, a lot of those kids who, there's one high school that said, our school is really white. There's not a lot of diversity in our town, but it's where we get exposure to other backgrounds is through books and television.
Mhm.
And that's always been really eye-opening for me because I think you always wonder, especially as a TV writer, like, am I should I have a job that's actually making a real like impact and a difference in the world? And I think it's a good reminder that, oh, it is making an impact just in a way that I maybe don't necessarily see all the
Right.
time. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that truly getting feedback from teenagers, getting emails from teenagers has been the best part of having the book out there.
Mhm. Well, I'm not an immigrant. I was born in the U.S. and speaking from my perspective, one of the things that I found really appealing about the book is that almost the ordinariness of the story in a way, of your personal life. It really personalizes some of the people that the immigration debate is really focused on. It's very easy when you look at the more, let's say, dramatic images of people crossing a border in Texas and kind of going through all the harsh depravities and difficulties that's entailed with that. It's easy not to personalize that, to look at that as an experience that's reserved for these people that are kind of an other in a way. It's very remote. But
Right.
your story and the way you told it humorously really shows like just how much of your experience was in many ways typically American, outside of what you're talking about with the
Yeah.
immigration difficulties. And I think it just did such a great job of putting a human face um, on the story so that you realize when you're talking about these policies broadly about how to treat this group of people, it's very easy sometimes for people to have this very impersonal attitude of, well, you're breaking the law, therefore, there's a harsh penalty and you deserve the penalty. But I think what your story does is it for somebody that reads the book, I think hopefully it changes their perspective on that and gives it a little more empathy and compassion because they can see themselves in the story more. So anyway, that's what I got out of it. And
That's
my
great.
my question around that is was that an intended effect of the way you wrote the book, or is that just something that I'm seeing through my particular lens?
I think in some ways it was intended, not even so much in terms of the fact that we didn't have green cards and we were undocumented, but I think it was really an intent to also make sure the readers had an understanding of what it's like to grow up with an Iranian family. I feel like
Right.
there's beyond the misconceptions about immigrating to this country legally or illegally, like the misconceptions about what it's like to be Iranian. And so I feel
Mhm.
like that was really important to me. So I think in some ways, I guess it was two birds, one stone.
Right.
But yeah, really wanting to make sure that people understood that I came from a very loving and supportive family, that in some ways my parents did fit the stereotypes that are out there about immigrant parents, but in a lot of ways they didn't.
Mhm.
And that really, like, I think the ultimate takeaway is for me is that they were trying to do whatever they could to give their kids a better life, which
Right.
I think I have two kids. Like, I think any parent can relate to that, is that you
Mhm.
will do whatever you can if it means that you will make whatever sacrifices you can if it means that your kids may have a better life than the one that you had or the one that we would have had we stayed in Iran.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think, obviously giving some specificity to the story so that people would have a little bit more empathy. Then it's much easier when you're, you know, seeing snippets on the news and then you can turn away from it and you don't know every personal story of every person that's crossing the border. And of course, like I also had a really privileged version of that experience. Like my parents were small business owners. We lived in the Bay Area, which is a really like nice suburban community in California, extremely expensive now. And in some ways we were incredibly lucky. But yeah, there was, and I use a lot of excerpts from my diaries from when I was a teenager, and I was kind of frustrated going through all of them because I was really hoping I would find more commentary on how I felt about our immigration status, and I barely mentioned it. And I think part of that was because, like you said, I was so wrapped up in my own high school dramas and like, things that I was going through with my friends or guys that I liked or insecurities that I had. But I would say it was always part of the backdrop of our upbringing, this sort of baseline anxiety about what could happen if we, if our application to get a green card was denied, like would we end up having to go back to Iran? So yeah, it was always something I felt a little bit anxious about, but I think my parents were really careful about trying to always, put on a happy face and say that everything was going to be okay, even when at times when it was obvious that it was not.
I thought there was really implicitly part of the story that pushed back on a stereotype is I think part of one of the negative stereotypes around undocumented immigrants is that they are somehow a burden on the country. They're largely here to take. They're not here to give. But if you look at your experience and your family's experience, that is not at all part of that story. Like spoiler alert, when you get to the end of your story, you've had a lot of success by any measure in your career, and you've contributed by any measure a lot to the country you live in. So your example, I don't know if that was intended. I have a feeling it wasn't, but your example really pushes back on that stereotype too. So I thought that was another area that came through very well, at least from my eyes.
That's so nice of you to say. I mean, definitely the part of that was intended was to make sure people understood. My parents were business owners. They paid taxes, like they paid property taxes, they paid income tax. Like I think that is a huge misconception that people that are undocumented are not putting money into the system. And that's just not the case. In fact, I mean, I learned a lot about the immigration process in researching my book. And I actually talked to the lawyer that represented my family. And one of the things too that I think people don't realize is a lot of people that are undocumented immigrants are paying into Social Security that they're not might never collect. So yeah, I wish that there was more messaging out there about what immigrants are actually giving to society. And I think a lot of that is confirmation bias. Like if you're anti-immigration, like you just don't want to hear any of that. But yeah, one thing I also think people never talk about, because the drumbeat that you always hear is immigrants are taking jobs away from Americans. And I've just always found it really interesting because no one really talks about automation in that same way, and how ATM machines and self-checkout and automated parking meters and all those things are theoretically also taking some jobs away, but no one seems to be protesting in the streets about those things. So I feel like at the core of the issue, there's something else going on. But thank you for saying that. My parents would be very, very proud. And I think that's part of the immigrant mentality, whether you're undocumented or not. There is this real feeling as an immigrant kid that my parents left a lot behind to bring me to America. I don't want that to have been in vain. What can I do to make them proud in the process?
Yeah, the other major theme I kind of read into the book is it's almost a love letter to your parents. It seems to me to be as much about them as it is about you. and you go through a lot of examples of the level of sacrifice that they went through to come here and stay here, the amount of devotion that they showed to you and your siblings to give you a chance to flourish in the country. And, as a parent myself, I have 2 kids. I'm really touched to see that level of gratitude. And, I have young kids, and my kids don't really show me much gratitude for anything that I do at a young
How old are
age.
your kids?
My kids are 13 and 11. So my 13-year-old, she's good. The 11-year-old, not so much on the gratitude front.
I mean, my
But-
kids are, I have a 4.5 and 2.5. And I feel,
All right.
I feel like the gratitude part, at least for me, comes in adulthood, like comes when our kids, the older they get, the more understanding we have of our parents.
I'm
and the
hoping
more
that's the
empathy we
case.
have for them.
I'm hoping.
Yeah, it'll come, I'm sure.
I don't feel like I need it, but it would still be nice.
Yeah, of course. Of course we need it. I really need it. We deserve it.
Yeah. Well, how, given that background that you laid out, how has the immigration journey shaped your relationship with your parents over time? I mean, has it been part of what shaped a relationship?
Yeah, it definitely has. I think as an adult, like especially in writing the book and looking back on what they went through, I think I definitely had more empathy for them than I did when I was a teenager. Because I realized too, I'm like, wow, this felt so scary and hard for me as a 14, 15, 16-year-old. But for my parents, they had the added pressure of, they had their own anxieties and fears about what could happen to our family, but they also had the added pressure of like, this is making our kids feel anxiety and fear. And of course, as a parent, you want to be able to take that pain away, and they weren't able to for a period of time. But I also think in some ways, like I've noticed as an adult, like there were a lot of things that happened in our immigration process that were out of their hands. And then I think there were some mistakes that they also made along the way that could have potentially made the process a little bit more streamlined, but who knows? But I think as an adult, I'm very I do not procrastinate. Like I always have a running to-do list. I feel like I stay on top of things all the time. And I think part of that is whether or not it's true. Like I had this feeling as a kid that, oh, if only they had done this, or if only they had done this sooner, then like maybe things would have been different. So I think I'm a little bit more type A from that experience. But yeah, I mean, I definitely have a lot of empathy for the stress that they were dealing with, not only because of our immigration process, but because it's hard to raise kids in a country that you didn't grow up in. Like they didn't have the same context for living in America that we did. And I feel like for a lot of immigrant parents, it must be like constantly living in a state of cognitive dissonance, because there's that part of you that brought your kids to America. You want them to assimilate. You brought them here for a reason. And there's that part of you that really doesn't want them to lose the culture that they came from. And so you're always trying to balance those two things. And that just adds a whole other layer to parenting that I don't feel like I have to deal with quite as much. Raising kids here and having grown up here. Like I definitely want to pass down a lot of the parts of my Iranian culture to my kids, but I don't feel like it's a conflict that I deal with day to day the way my parents probably did.
And so I don't know if you've had this discussion with them. If not, I'm going to ask you to guess. If they were sitting here and I were to ask them, reflecting on this multi-decade odyssey to come here and go through all they went through to establish your family here, would they say that it was worth it?
Oh, I think they would 100% say it was worth it, especially considering how challenging things are economically in Iran right now, especially with the sanctions. Like COVID is terrible there. Like it's just a really hard way of life, aside from all the ramifications of the Islamic Revolution and how that was sort of a reality that they didn't want to exist under. Like even if you took all of that away, I think there's a lot of hardships in Iran that we don't have to necessarily deal with day to day in America. So I think that they would acknowledge that they do, it was a difficult journey to get there, but I think they do have a more comfortable life in the States
Mm,
than they would have had if we stayed in Iran. Um, and I think they see that their kids really, luckily are thriving, and that's definitely a testament to how they raised us. But um, yeah, I think that they would, I think we're sort of a product of their sacrifices, and I think that they wouldn't do it any other way. But of course, I think they also have a lot of nostalgia for the Iran that they lived in, and I've never gone back, but my mom went back. Gosh, I guess it's been almost 20 years now since she went
mm,
back, but I remember she when she returned, she had a really hard time because it felt like that's not the Iran that she remembers. So she didn't feel quite at home there, and she
right.
doesn't feel quite at home here either. So she felt a little bit lost, I think, when she got back. So I know that part of leaving the country has always been hard for them, but yeah, I don't think that they would have done it any other way.
This is I think probably a related question. There's this, from what I see, there's this societal narrative that if you're an undocumented immigrant in the US, your options here are limited in terms of what you can do and what you could accomplish. From reading your memoir, you don't seem to have gotten that memo, that your options were limited because of your immigration status. Where did you get either the audacity to hear that message and ignore it, or the blissful ignorance of not hearing that message at all? I'm not sure which it is. But where did it come from that you didn't seem to have that limiting perspective that maybe society tries to force on people?
That's such a good question. These are really good questions. I do think that there was a little bit of blissful ignorance, but I think that I mean there was definitely some clear obstacles too. Like, it made it harder in terms of I was a little bit luckier than my sister because by the time we got work permits and employment authorization and social security cards, I was like I think I was 14 at the time, so I was just
Mhm.
at the age where I wanted to get an after school job, and so I was able to do all of those things. I feel like the age that she was at, she was always running up against more obstacles.
Mhm.
Um, but it really, again, like, um, it, I hate to sound redundant, but that did come from my parents. Like, there was definitely a big messaging when we were growing up that you can do anything in this country. Like, that
Mhm.
was something that they always told us. Like, this is America. You can be whatever you want. You can do whatever you want to do. And whether or not that's actually true for all of us, like, that's what they told us. And
Mhm.
so I feel like that's what I internalized. And I do think, again, having seen their work ethic and the sacrifices they made have just, I think, passed on a strong work ethic to me and made me feel pretty determined.
Mhm.
Um, and I also think too, it helps that I had an occupation that I felt passionate about pursuing. So I was pretty ambitious when it came to wanting to be a writer, even though there was a lot of things that stood in my way of that had nothing to do with my immigration status. I mean,
Mhm.
what's really interesting and gratifying looking back is that Americanized, the book, opened a lot of doors for me. So it's just a nice full circle thing to realize that the element of my life as a teenager that felt like the biggest obstacle, um, years later, has ended up being like something that created a lot of opportunities for
Yeah,
me
it's a source
because
of strength. Yeah.
I think part of that came from I was willing to talk about it. Um, but the thing I was most ashamed of as a teenager is something as an adult that I'm like, oh, this is actually something really interesting and unique about my experience that
Mhm.
might help other people. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that was we just grew up with parents that were constant. Maybe they needed to say it to believe it to confirm their decisions to move to America, but we always heard like, you can do whatever you want here. Like, this is the land of opportunity. That was definitely something that we heard over and over again. I
Did you feel
question that as an adult now, but I think as a teenager, it was helpful to hear that.
did you feel like weight from having to kind of almost justify how much they sacrificed to have you in this position here, that you really better make this worthwhile. Was there, not necessarily imposed by them, but just on yourself, did you have pressure to succeed because of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was a great motivator. In the book, I write about something I coined called immigrant child guilt complex,
Mhm.
which is basically, I joke about it as being a disorder that you are constantly living with the guilt of all the sacrifices that your parents made for you. So you always feel this need to succeed. And my parents were never very strict. I mean, they always wanted us to do well. They cared about our grades. They would have been concerned if we were doing poorly in school. But when it came to like a career path, they were very supportive of me trying to pursue writing as a career,
Mhm.
even though it's not the most stable job. Um, but I think that yeah, I mean they were always extremely supportive, but I did notice along the way, like I'll just use one example. Like I noticed a lot in college, like my peers who were American, who grew up here, like treated college as a different experience as the way that I treated it. Like I really
Mhm.
felt like I got made fun of by my friends a lot of the time. They're like, Zara reads everything, that reads every assignment and like does everything and always like does her papers on time. And but I think there was this part of me that was like, this is expensive. Like this is an expensive experience that my parents are paying for. And yeah, I want to enjoy myself and have fun too, but I also want to like milk this for all it's worth because
Mhm.
they're paying to put me through school. So I think in that way, I would pick up on those differences. Like, oh, this is like a totally different outlet for my friends versus like I ended up actually I went to school at UC Santa Cruz as an undergrad for 2 years and I ended up leaving because I felt like I needed something that felt a little bit more academic than what
Mhm.
I was getting there. So I transferred to Berkeley, and that was definitely a different pace in terms of how much harder it felt.
Mhm.
But I think part of the reason for that was I was like, this doesn't really feel like a good use of my time. But I think those decisions probably came from a place of my parents are spending a lot of money. My parents have sacrificed a lot. I want to
Yeah.
get the most out of that as I can.
So I know you noted in the book that the 2016 election and the Trump campaign and presidency started while you were writing the book. And
Mhm.
there is definitely that brought on a level of harshness to the immigration debate and then subsequently to policy that didn't really exist before. At least it didn't exist for a long time.
Right.
Um, how is that, while that's going on, how has that changed your view of America, if it did at all?
Um, I don't know if it did change my view that much because I think I've always felt a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. Like I think it's impossible to not feel that when you are an immigrant or a child of immigrants or dealing with your status as an immigrant. So I don't think that those things were surprising to me. I guess it was a little scary that people felt emboldened to express those views in a way that they hadn't before. Um, but I certainly felt like because of that election, that it was really important to get the book out there in a different way. That it felt like, in some ways, I felt like it was a moral imperative to get the story out there to say like these things that you're hearing, like this is not what my experience was. Um, so yeah, in some ways it was motivation. Like I think I was doing copy edits on the book when Trump got elected. And so
Mhm.
that was like devastating in many ways, but I think it just made myself and my editor feel like, okay, well this just means like the story is more important and more topical now than maybe
Mhm.
it would have been if Hillary Clinton had been elected.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean even today it's just it's still really disappointing anytime I talk to somebody that has like very clear anti-immigrant views. But I think, yeah, the more you can get your personal story out there, like I don't know, sometimes you wonder, am I just preaching to the choir? Like maybe the people who are enjoying this book are people that agree with me anyway. But I would hope that at least like a lot of teens that are reading it are at least getting a window into what the process of trying to become a permanent resident in this country is like, and why it's more challenging than most people understand.
Do you see anything positive that's come out of the, let's say, the intensified debate around immigration in the last 5 or 6 years?
I mean, I would say probably, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think that people that probably were never paying attention are probably paying more attention now and are probably becoming advocates for the cause.
Mhm.
So I think that that's really great. And I think one of the things that I hope is more beneficial to anyone who's going through the process of trying to become a legal resident of this country is that when I was experiencing it as a teenager, it really felt like such a shameful secret. Like it wasn't something that we told people about, it wasn't something that we talked about. And so, really, the only other person my age that I knew who was going through it was my sister. I do feel like there's a little bit more sense of community. There's a little bit more sense of, and maybe that's because of forums like Twitter. But I do feel like there feels like there's a more public support system
Mhm.
now for the cause than there was when I was dealing with it as a teenager. And hopefully that makes people feel a little bit more, I don't know. I just hope that people get some comfort from that.
Mm. I mean, again, speaking from the perspective of somebody that's not an immigrant, I had the luxury, I guess, to be naive about some of the strong views that a lot of the country has on immigration and a whole host of other social issues. And what I guess I learned that there are certain amounts of progress that have occurred in my lifetime that you can't take for granted that are always going to occur. Where I believe America in a lot of ways is an exceptional country, but we're every bit as capable of backtracking on progress that we've made as any other
Right.
country. So this idea that this ever climb upwards in that regard could just be on autopilot, it's not true. I'm too young.
Right.
I wasn't born during the 60s, so I wasn't around for that era when there was a large struggle on civil rights. So I guess, I probably had a bit of a view that I took some things for granted that I probably shouldn't have. So if I could see some sort of silver lining, hopefully I'm not alone in that regard. And you learn to appreciate some things that you have here more than you did before, and B, understand that you gotta work on and you gotta fight for the progress and the rights that we have here. So
Definitely, yeah.
um
Yeah, I definitely think it was a wake-up call in a lot of ways, and one that we needed.
and are you optimistic on that front now that the wake up call has come, that the long-term trend in the US is to be more welcoming towards immigrants than it has been?
Um, I hope so. I mean, it's in some ways it's hard to feel optimistic because I feel like just looking at how divided the country is, it's
Mhm.
like I almost feel like, yeah, well, I feel like half the country's going to be more supportive. Um, so in some ways, it's like I guess it's like glass half full or glass half empty question. Um, but I do think that there's a lot to be optimistic about. I just would hope to see that. I think there's definitely a lot of frustrations in terms of um, seeing that we have made political change in the White House and the Senate and the House, and feeling like things still aren't really progressing in the direction that
Yeah.
we'd like to. And so I feel like as somebody that is pretty liberal, and that can be very frustrating, and can be very disheartening. And at a certain point, I'm like, oh, I kind of understand what it feels like now to be a disengaged voter, because I feel like you need to have some self-preservation, and
Mhm.
constantly getting this bad news is not necessarily helpful. But yeah, I think that the worst thing that we can do is just completely check out.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess I am optimistic, but I think it's also hard to not be cynical at times. you kind of go back and forth, I think, in the reality that we live in now.
Well, it's possible that 50-50 split that you're describing changes at some point in the future for the positive. You noted this someplace, I don't remember where I read it, but you noted that the last time we had amnesty in the country, it was under Ronald Reagan, who was a conservative Republican. So there is a possibility to reach people who have that ideology to get behind being more welcoming to immigrants. It's not happening right now, but that may happen in the future. It's possible. So
yeah, I feel like we're really bad at marketing and branding in some ways. Like I think that if we could get the messaging out there in terms of how immigration does make this country stronger, why it's better for the economy, like all the ways that Americans benefit from it, versus this narrative that's always been out there that this is only making, that there's that they're dipping into the pot and you're getting less because of it, like you were saying, this sort of idea that immigrants are here to take. If we could get that messaging out there in a better, stronger way, I mean, again, like, I don't know, maybe we would just be preaching to people who want to listen to it. But yeah, I think that that's somewhere where the left has always struggled a bit with messaging.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think your approach is really powerful in that regard, because if I do talk to people that are anti-immigrant overall, they will always have exceptions in their heads for people that they personally know somehow in their community. That this is on a big level, this is all horrible and bad, but for these people that live next door to me and my kids go to school with them, they're okay. They're good ones. So, to get out there the idea that, well, yes, I'm sure your neighbors are good people, but it's really not a unique situation. They're not these tremendous outliers in the regard that the majority of people that are immigrating here are bad and taking, and you just happen to luck upon this handful of people here. So, I think that's the power of storytelling. And that's the power of storytellers, that you're able to get that more into the public consciousness, that's something that's not necessarily a one-off.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I do think too that we were very fortunate that our story had a happy ending and that we were finally able to become citizens, even though it took over 20 years for that to happen. But yeah, I don't know that I would have been I definitely would not have been able to write the same story if I was in the thick of that process. I think it really was helpful that I could look back on it with the relief of knowing that I was now a citizen, that I wasn't dealing with those things anymore, but with a whole lot of empathy for people who still
are. Is there anything that you're working on now that you'd like to discuss that's kind of germane or relevant?
Yeah. I have another young adult book that's going to be coming out in October 2022, and this time it's fiction. And for better or worse, it's about two best friends who are separated due to a global pandemic. So I really wanted to, I mean, now that we're like, a year and a half deep into this thing, there's part of me that feels like, oh, there's so much pandemic fatigue. And like even writing it at times, I felt like, oh, I want to escape this reality. But I felt like it was really important to see this experience from the perspective of teenagers, because I don't know, I just felt so bad for high school seniors who didn't get to have a prom and didn't get to have a high school graduation. And I kind of wanted to delve into that from the perspective of two best friends too. Like I'm very interested in like examining female friendship in the book. But one of the characters is Iranian American and her best friend is Mexican American. So I also wanted to see how their pandemic experiences were different based on their socioeconomic backgrounds. And then Americanized, I actually developed it as a pilot for ABC, and it didn't get a green light. And then I redeveloped it at Disney Plus and it didn't get a green light there. But usually it's pretty easy to walk away from stuff after you've been working on it for a while. You're like, okay, this project is dead. Like it's time to move on. But I would really like to, I'm now thinking of writing it as more of a coming of age feature
Mhm.
movie instead of a TV series, because I feel like a lot of the movies that I like, I love the John Hughes movies growing up, and then even other movies like Juno and Lady Bird have these great female coming of age storylines,
Mhm.
but I don't feel like we've really gotten the young immigrant perspective on those same stories. So somewhere in my spare time, I'd really like to explore the idea of adapting it as a 2 hour long story instead of a series.
It's really inspiring to see you revisit those themes. And the reason being is because, to me, it's always such a nice thing to see that when somebody is able to find what their talents are, their superpowers, and I'm sure you have many more than this, but just what I see is you're obviously a gifted storyteller, and you have a phenomenal way of communicating with humor, and to be able to take that and to apply it on these causes and on these themes that you're really passionate about is such a great thing to watch, somebody kind of fulfilling their potential
Oh,
in
that was
that
so
regard, that
nice.
it's really, yeah, it's very inspiring, and it's something that I think all of us who should aspire to do, and it's something worth being envious of. So it's really great to watch
Oh,
that. So
thank you.
yeah.
That's
um
really nice. I don't know that it ever feels like a superpower, especially on the writing book front. I just feel like writing books is so much harder than writing a script. So
yeah.
usually while I'm doing it, there's always the voice in my head that's like, I don't know how to write. I don't know how to put string a sentence together. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and speaking of superpowers, really looking forward to the Green Lantern. So
Oh
that's
yeah,
it's one
it's
of the
gonna be.
characters I liked when I was a kid. I liked the Green Lantern. I
Oh
even liked
really?
Guy Gardner, all that stuff. So definitely,
Well, Guy Gardner's one of our leads in this show, so
yeah.
it's a really ambitious, interesting take on the comic. And as somebody who kind of came into it cold, not
Mhm.
knowing much about the mythology, it's been really fun to learn more about the mythology and then also see ways that we can kind of reinvent it
Mhm.
um, without losing like the essence of what the fans love
Mhm.
about the comics. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's definitely like initially when I took the job, I'm like, I don't know if this is really in my wheelhouse, but so much of it is about these characters' journeys and how in some ways they feel marginalized or
Mhm.
isolated and how they're able to overcome that.
Right.
So I think it's going to be a really, really great show.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. So before we go, is there anything else you'd like to share? Any parting comments or advices that you may have for anybody listening?
I mean, yeah, I think if anybody's listening that has gone through what I went through, or knows anybody who is, like, I would like to say that I hope that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for them, because I know that it can be very agonizing. And I think, I mean, actually, one thing I will say to anybody who's listening that doesn't have any experience with being undocumented or being an immigrant, I think the last year and a half of that feeling of uncertainty is sort of what immigrants live with all the time
Mm.
in a lot of ways. I think that if you are struggling with finding empathy, like maybe just think about how this pandemic has felt and not
Mm.
really knowing like, what the future was going to look like, and not really being able to plan for the future in a lot of ways. And I think that that's, I can't speak, obviously, I cannot speak for everyone who's undocumented, and my family's experience was very different than, many, but I would say like you just are living with uncertainty. And I think a
Mm.
lot of people can now relate to that in a way that they couldn't before.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that was great. And for anybody who hasn't read the book that's listening, I really recommend that you read it. It's a great read. So thank you for being on. Really, really
Thank you so
appreciate your
much.
time.